Alright, this is going to be Chapter 8, the nervous system, and this is going to be Part 2 of 3. In this area we're going to cover meninges, burr holes, epidural, subdural damage, nervous system infections, the spinal cord injuries, the brain, the ventricles of the brain, hydrocephalus, aphasia, and dyslexia, and then seizures. First thing we're going to talk about here is the meninges, and in case you're wondering here, meningitis, meninges, and it's pretty much the same area. The three linings that line the brain and the spinal column are the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. Dura matter is pretty much on the outside covering, forms the outermost covering of the central nervous system, pretty much made of loose connective tissue. Blood vessels lie in here. And then adipose tissue or fat. Actually, fat cells will be lining in this area in the dura mater. The arachnoid separates the inner surface of the dura mater from the secondary meningeal layer. Small quantity of lymphatic fluid. Subarachnoid space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And then we have the pia, innermost meningeal layer, and this is the one that's going to be the closest to the brain. Blood vessels that service the brain run actually along this area. Clinical notes, burr holes. Bleeding in the epidural outside the dural space is called an epidural hematoma, caused from blunt head trauma. Causes rapid swelling. A burr hole is a life-saving maneuver that a hole is drilled to relieve the pressure from the damaging the brain. And the picture is always better. Okay, so we actually have from the outside, or from the inside going out, so going this direction, we have the pia. The next layer is the arachnoid, and then the dura. P-A-D. Now, a subdural hematoma or an epidural hematoma would be on the outside in between the skull and the dura, which would allow it to push entire regions downward and may cause brain damage. A subdural hematoma would be underneath the dura. And a subarachnoid bleed would be underneath the arachnoid area, which would be bad. The pia would be the only thing. See, subarachnoid space would be a bleed. A subarachnoid bleed would be a bleed in here. A subdural hematoma would be in this spot here. And then the epidural space, and this is what would contain the adipose tissue in this area. So again, P-A-D. Clinical notes, nervous system infection, and we're going to talk about meningitis. In this section we're going to talk about lumbar puncture, viral meningitis, usual forms of meningitis, parasitic brain infections, brain abscesses, and encephalitis. So they do a lumbar puncture to see if you actually have meningitis. They actually take a sample of your cerebral spinal fluid and they'll test it for infection. And how they do that is they'll look for cloudiness or any white blood cells that might be in there, and then they'll culture it. If it grows something, then it probably has a bacterial infection in it. Not too many things can cross across the blood-brain membrane, so if you get bacterial meningitis, it is generally deadly. Look for cloudy substance from the white blood cells that might be dead. Culture a sample for organism identification. Viral meningitis will not culture anything out. However, it does contain white blood cells in the CSF sample. Usual forms of meningitis are going to be fungal. You have TB that can actually get in there as well and make meningitis. Tuberculosis in the meningeal area, it's still an infection. And then obviously decreased immune system from HIV or forming of AIDS. Parasitic brain infections. Flatworms or tapeworms can actually bore holes in your brain and eat brain tissue, which would not be a good thing. And then you can have a localized abscess or a pus pocket essentially in your brain, and then this right here is where all of this came from, is an abscess in the brain. I'm pretty sure that this is post-mortem. Encephalitis, which is essentially swelling of your brain, usually viral in origin, can be carried by mosquitoes, and then there's some of the most common causes: EE, WEE, Simian River Congo virus also is in forms of encephalitis. And then last but not least here, we're getting close to the end of this list here. We have prion disease, and prions are pretty much smaller than a virus. A virus is something that gets inside of your DNA factory and it makes new parts of it. So every cell that your body makes after that is infected by the actual virus. A prion is nothing more than a protein chain. Not a whole strand, but just a section of a protein, and this encodes in an area that can cause disease. Now, an example of a prion disease is going to be mad cow disease. Spinal cord, we're going to talk about gross anatomy and sectional anatomy in here. 317, gross anatomy, central canal, narrowing internal passage filled with cerebral spinal fluid. We have the dorsal root ganglion. If everyone will remember back from the first slide set, dorsal means sensory and ventral means motor, or we have control over it. So the dorsal root ganglia, cell bodies of the sensory neurons, and this is where all the sensory information would come back to. And then we have the dorsal roots. They contain the axons for the dorsal root ganglia and bring sensory information. And then we have ventral roots, and these are all terms, contains the axon of the central nervous system, motor neurons that control muscles and glands. And this is pretty much, if you'll take a look up here to this cross section, the dorsal root, and this kind of looks like a butterfly. This is considered the horn of the spinal column. This is gray matter here, and this is white matter. And then this would be all the sensory input, and then this would be the control, either to the organs or arms and legs, things that we would have conscious thought over. Sectional anatomy: horns, columns, ascending tracts, and descending tracts. The horns are pretty much projections of gray matter. The columns are white matter on each side, posterior, anterior, laterally, connected by anterior white commissure. Ascending tracts carry sensory information towards the brain, and the descending tracts convey motor commands into the spinal column. And that's where all of these are. And again, here's that butterfly again. These are considered the horns. Somatic sensory, visceral sensory, which would be organ sensory, visceral motor, I'm going to tell an organ what to do, and somatic motor, I'm going to move my arm. So again, dorsal input, ventral output. And this is a dissection of the proximal spinal cord. A lot of little parts in there, a lot of little nerves. 3.19, clinical notes: spinal cord injuries. We can have a cord concussion, cord contusion, cord compression, cord laceration, complete transection, incomplete transection, and a cord hemorrhage. Cord concussion is a temporary interruption in function. A cord contusion is pretty much bruising of the neural tissue. Cord compression, pressure on the cord causing ischemia. Cord laceration, tearing of the cord. A complete transection, which would be severing of the spinal column or spinal cord. Incomplete transection, a part of the cord is severed. And then cord hemorrhage, bleeding into the neural tissues. Again, this could cause pressure in an enclosed area and cause damage later on. And these are some of the mechanisms of injury. Up here up top, flexion injury, a compression injury from diving, hyperextension, distraction. This generally will transect it. Flexion rotation, which you get tearing, twisting, and then penetration injury, which would be like a knife or a sword. 3.21, the brain. And we're going to talk about major divisions: the ventricles, the cerebrum, basal nuclei, limbic, diencephalon, midbrain pons, cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. Major divisions: the cerebrum, conscious thought, right and left hemispheres, and this is where most of your formulation and your thinking and your thought process goes on. The diencephalon, or hollow connected. They're hollow and they're connected to the cerebrum. My apologies. Thalamus is the largest portion of the diencephalon. Hypothalamus, emotions and autonomic function and hormone production, and then the epithalamus, which houses the pineal gland. The brainstem contains 3 sections. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is a processing center for the cerebrum to the cerebellum. The pons is a bridge connects the cerebellum to the brainstem, and the medulla oblongata segment of the brainstem is connected to the spinal cord. And then the medulla, we're going to see a lot of our autonomic functions here, to where we're actually we have an automatic process, like we're breathing or we need to change blood pressure and so on. And so longitudinal fissure, which means pretty much a groove, and then these are the right and left hemispheres here. And we have all of these little grooves, which we're going to name some of them. And we'll get to these sections here in a second. Corpus callosum, the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata. 3.24, the ventricles of the brain. A central passageway that expands into 4 chambers. These are pretty much holes in your brain that house things, neurotransmitters, spinal fluid. 2 lateral ventricles are in each hemisphere, so the left and the right hemispheres have a ventricle or a central passageway in each one of them. In the diencephalon, we have the 3rd ventricle, and the 4th ventricle is in the pons and the upper medulla. So we actually have 4 ventricles in the brain. And here they are from the side, left and right, and then your 3rd ventricle is down here, which is better seen in this shot, and then the 4th ventricle, which is this area here. Cerebral spinal fluid provides support, pretty much the brain floats in it, produced in the choroid plexus, arachnoid granulations. Diffusion across the arachnoid granulations returns excessive cerebral spinal fluid to venous circulation. And the body pretty much treats this like plasma. So here are the arachnoid granulations, and this is a blow-up of them. We'll talk about those in a second. So the choroid plexus of the 3rd ventricle, and this allows for cerebral spinal fluid to kind of circulate around, and if there's too much of it, what happens is we'll evacuate a little bit, and that's what this is here. Endothelial lining, and this is an arachnoid granulation, and then this would move the cerebral spinal fluid, which is pretty much proteinous fluid, out and into the vasculature or the vessels. The cerebrum, largest region in the brain, conscious thought, is housed in here. Includes gray matter and white matter. Structure of the cerebral hemisphere. We have a lot of terms here. Gyri, outer surface forms a series of elevated ridges, and these are the little grooves that we're actually in. We keep seeing all those little nooks and crannies. Fissures, which are deep grooves. Longitudinal fissures separate the cerebral hemispheres from left and right. Lobes, regions in each hemisphere. Central sulcus extends laterally from the longitudinal fissure. Frontal lobe, anterior to the central sulcus, and lateral sulcus, inferiorly bordered by the lateral sulcus. Temporal lobe, inferior to the lateral sulcus. Parietal lobe extends between the central sulcus and the parietal and parieto-occipital sulcus. And then we have the occipital lobe, remaining lobes from above. Association areas. Association areas are sensor and motor region connections that occur in the body, and we'll look at some of these here in just a second. Somatic sensory association area, or premotor cortex, monitors activity in the primary sensory cortex. Somatic motor association area, responsible for coordinating learned movement. So if we learn how to actually write our name, it would be responsible for coordinating those movements. Cortical connections. The corpus callosum. Axons of different lengths interconnect gyri with a single cerebral hemisphere and link the two hemispheres. Connects various regions of the cerebral cortex by white matter which lies beneath. Cerebral processing center. We have the general interpretive area, or Wernicke's area, receives information from all the sensory associated areas. The speech center, or Broca's area, regulates the pattern of breathing and vocalization. Prefrontal coordination, information from the association areas, predicting consequences of events or actions. Example of this, if I stick my hand on a hot stove, it's hot. That would be something that we can understand the consequences on. Hemispheric lateralization, left, interpretive speech, centers, and language skills. Right, analyzes sensory information and relates the body to the sensory environment. And an electrocephalogram, a printed record of electrical activity in the brain. We have different types of memory that also need to be talked about here. We have fact memory, like the United States has multiple areas in it called states. The sky is blue, the grass is green, things like that. Fact memories, specific bits of information. And then we have skill memories, learned motor behaviors. So I learned how to write my name or how to write the ABCs when I was very young, and it stuck with you. It's in a long-term memory, and it's a skill memory. Short-term memories, and short-term memories don't last very long. They don't stick around. Long-term memories, we generally associate them and put them into long-term memory, remain for much longer amounts of time. And then we have amnesia, which is a loss of memory from disease or trauma. And then this is the hemisphere surface. Central sulcus, which is pretty much a dividing line for front and back. Parietal lobe, this area here. And then this is the primary sensory cortex here. This is the precentral or primary motor cortex here. Somatic motor association, premotor cortex here. Visual association area, and then this is our visual cortex, and this is the back or the posterior side. This is the anterior portion. So we actually interpret all of our sight at the back of our brain instead of the front. The frontal lobe is pretty much essentially conscious thought. It's an accumulation of who we are. The corpus callosum, from the definition, allows bilateral communication of the left and right hemispheres. Analysis by touch, handwriting skills on the left hemisphere, spatial visualization. I think that thing will fit in there. General interpretive center, language and mathematic calculation. If you have a stroke here, you may have aphasia. Visual cortex, right. Visual cortex, left. And this is actually the right hand and the left hand. But not only does it go upside down and backwards, it starts from here and will travel all the way across, the same as here. The basal nuclei. Masses of gray matter that lie beneath the lateral ventricles and within the central white matter of each cerebral hemisphere. And then these are these here. This entire area. This is the start of it. The limbic system establishes emotional states, links the conscious intellectual functions of the cerebral cortex with the unconscious, long-term memory storage retrieval. One of the things we see with the limbic system, and more specific the amygdala, is PSDT, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Whenever you see horrible things and they're loaded with stress hormones, it's kind of like having a neon sign when it's chemically encoded into the brain. So if you ever hear somebody say, every time I close my eyes I see it, that's because that's the loudest station in here. This is giving information. The diencephalon, the hypothalamus, pineal melatonin, is pretty much a hormone that it secretes. The thalamus, coordinating voluntary and involuntary motor commands, and then the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus does quite a bit. Subconscious control of the skeletal muscle contractions associated with rage, pleasure, pain, sexual arousal, adjust activities in the autonomic centers and the pons of the medulla oblongata. So that's going to be respiratory centers. Coordinates activity of the nervous and endocrine system. Secretes a variety of hormones, including antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, which we'll learn about in the endocrine chapter. 3.40, the midbrain, controls reflex movements of the eyes, neck, head, and response to visual stimuli. The pons links the cerebellum with the midbrain. Diencephalon, cerebrum, and spinal cord. So whenever we look at these, all of these over here, which at some point you're going to need to know the cranial nerves, probably in this chapter we'll talk over them, are cranial nerves and where they actually come out at. So we have the thalamus, midbrain, diencephalon area, and then the medulla oblongata. Most of our autonomic functions is controlled from this spot right here. The cerebellum, automatic processing center, two important functions. Just the postural muscles of the body to maintain balance, programs and fine-tunes movement control at the conscious and subconscious levels. 3.44, the medulla oblongata, adjust heart rate, strength of the cardiac contractions, and flow of blood to the periphery. Basic pace for the respiratory movements. And the respiratory centers, pneumotaxic centers, are in the medulla oblongata. 3.45, clinical notes here, is hydrocephalus. And hydrocephalus is pretty much an abnormal accumulation of cerebral spinal fluid. This can be congenital or actually acquired. Aphasia and dyslexia. Aphasia is damage to the general interpretive area or associated sensory tract. And this is going to be in language. So if you had an expressive dysphagia, aphasia stroke, what would happen is you may be able to hear and understand the language, but you might not be able to articulate or speak. And that would also go into dysphagia. You may be able to speak, but you can't. I got those flipped. Let's say that you have dysphagia, so you do not have the ability or have an altered ability to speak. Aphasia means language understanding. So someone could be talking something and you not really absolutely do not understand the words coming out of their mouth. It may be your daughter, it may be your son. So if you had a stroke and have aphasia, then you're probably not going to be able to understand the language. Dyslexia, problems with the processing and sorting of visual information. Clinical notes here on seizures. This is just about the end of this slide set. We have a couple types here we're going to talk about. We'll talk about this more in neurology whenever we get in the paramedic chapters. But we have grand mal, which is full tonic-clonic movement. Pretty much their entire body is involved in this contracting and relaxing. That's what full tonic-clonic, full body. May have a postictal confusion, so they have had an electrical firestorm in their head, and it may take them a few minutes to kind of reset things and get things to where they're working again. An absent seizure, or petit mal, is another type of seizure, and it's a sudden loss of consciousness. Now, this may not be complete. In absent seizures, you may see someone just staring up and look at the ceiling and then just stare there for a little while. Focal seizure. Focal seizures pretty much are mistaken for psychiatric. Focal seizures could be, you could have a seizure in your visual cortex or your speech cortex or both, or something that would be asphasic to where you may not understand. Everyone seems foreign. So most people that have focal seizures If it would be an alteration in mood or an alteration, they may just flip, like they become psychotic or something like that. But in either case, these are often mistaken for psychiatric disorders. And if you have any questions concerning this, name is Roy Smith. Phone number you can reach me at is 405-219-7613. I can be reached or emailed at smithr@imsa.net. Thank you.